I know that some of you were here in September when we started this year's Taubman Symposia in Jewish Studies. You may remember that we started with a very, very distinguished diplomat by the name of Ambassador Dennis Ross. This afternoon, we're completing this year's programming with probably one of the most distinguished American historians of the Jews at work today, and a man who I've known really for almost half a century, I think, almost half a century. And we haven't aged. Stephen Zipperstein, as you see from the brochure, is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish Culture and History at Stanford University. And over the course of his career, he has taught at universities in Russia, Poland, France, England, and Israel. For 16 years, he was the director of the Jewish Studies program, the director of the Taub Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford University, and he is the author and editor of 9 books, including, and all of them are just absolutely extraordinary. I wrote extraordinary after each of the books, but in 1986, he published The Jews of Odessa, A Cultural History, which won a national award in the field of Jewish studies. His elusive Prophet, Achad Ha'am, and the Origins of Zionism, which he published in 1993, was a winner of the National Jewish Book Award. Imagining Russian Jewry, which he published in 1999, is a winner of the, it was, a number of his books have been awarded some of the most prestigious prizes and awards in the field of Russian history, Jewish history. However, he is also the editor of an extraordinary series of books. There are 45 of them. They're called the Jewish Lives series. I brought in one of the most recent ones. This is entitled Alfred Stieglitz, Taking Pictures, Making Painters, written by Phyllis Rose. There are 45 of these books on Jewish lives published in Yale University Press, and they're just absolutely extraordinary. He edits this series of books with Anita Shapira, and the National Jewish Book Council, for the first time, awarded it a major award for its contributions to Jewish thought. When we saw that Professor Zipperstein's latest book, Pogrom, Kishinev and the Tilt of History, and I love the subtitle, The Tilt of History. Just an absolutely fantastic, I think, title and idea. We immediately invited him. I called him, I believe, on the phone, or I wrote to him immediately, and we were fortunate enough to plan this event as the closure of our academic program of speakers this year. This book, Pogrom, which at the end of the talk this afternoon is available through our good colleagues and friends at Chaucer's, and Professor Zipperstein will sign the copies for you. I see that some of you have already purchased them. So this book has been widely reviewed in newspapers and magazines in the United States and England, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New Statesman, Literary Review, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Economist, Haaretz, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Mosaic magazine, and almost all of them have named it one of the best books of the year. So this is an extraordinary, extraordinary opportunity to learn about this event in Bessarabia at the beginning of the 20th century. The book provides an extraordinary rereading and interpretation of the Kishinev violence. And Avishai Margalit concludes in his review of Pogrom in the current New York Review of Books by stating that Zipperstein, quote, goes beyond the statistics to offer a story, one both singular and significant, unquote. Anyone who has read a few paragraphs of anything that Zipperstein has written will immediately agree with Avishai Margalit's statement about Stephen Zipperstein being a great storyteller. So I'd like to now invite you to welcome one of the great storytellers of Jewish history currently at work. Please welcome Stephen Zipperstein.
I'm going to certainly disappoint you. You know, I used to think of Rick Hecht as a friend. I want to thank Rick. I'll talk loudly, and this will work. I mean, I haven't tested this among the full range of Gentile audiences, but I have noticed that among Jewish audiences in particular, there's always someone who says they can't hear you before you begin to speak. And so I don't know if it's an ethnic inflection or not, but I've been on a fairly extensive book tour, and I have tested this, and it's sometimes that man who was brought along to the talk by his wife and who falls asleep actually after you speak for a moment or two. But I probably shouldn't have said that. I want to thank Rick Hecht. I want to thank Maeve McCoy and the staff of Jewish Studies for being such marvelous hosts. What I'll do today is I'll speak a bit about the initial trajectory of this book, read a tiny bit from its beginning, then trace how it came about and its various pieces, because it's a study not only of the event itself, but primarily a study of how actually it etched itself onto history. Most of what happens in the past is forgotten. No doubt, for example, there were many African American women, presumably there was more than just Rosa Parks, who refused to stand up and give up that seat. But Rosa Parks, that was etched onto history. And how something is etched onto history is really what my book is about. This actually was one of the smallest anti-Jewish atrocities in late Tsarist history, and yet it's the one that is the most remembered. It's the best documented of all events probably in the Russian Jewish past, and the most mythologized. So almost everything that tends to be known about it is factually wrong. I wrote this book, finished it, before the term fake news became ubiquitous, alas. But in many ways, it really is about that phenomenon, the way in which fact competes with myth, the way in which history is full of pockmarks, and once you begin to tell a historical story, you begin to stutter. History, if you will, sounds like Jeb Bush. Myth sounds like the other guy. And that's the backdrop to this book. Let me read you from the beginning of it, talk to you a little bit about how it came about and its main themes, and then perhaps I'll read from the last page or two, and then we'll open for discussion. And everyone just heard me, right? Good. Okay. Okay, it's working out. Little, if anything, regarding Kishinev's riot would be either clear-cut or simple. Meticulously documented then and later, it would inspire a veritable thicket of myths extending well beyond the confines of Jewish communal or political life. Its impact, surprisingly enough, felt on endeavors as varied as the pre-state Haganah or nascent Israeli army, the NDoubleACP, and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Simple the story would not be, even in terms of its most obvious details from the moment it occurred. Hence the pertinence of the account of Sergei Urusov, appointed Governor General of the Bessarabia province, Kishinev was its capital, to replace his disgraced successor soon after the pogrom. He relates in his memoirs how at the time of his appointment he knew as little about the region as he might have about faraway New Zealand, and felt fortunate that a guidebook to the area had just been published. He pored over the book during his journey from Petersburg and carried it with him on his first few days in the provincial capital. He had the volume in hand as he made his way into one of the worst of the city's neighborhoods, known as Lower Kishinev or Old Town, the epicenter of the April anti-Jewish massacre. There, he writes, he sought the river that was reportedly nearby, quote, nearing the end of town. I vainly tried to see the river mentioned. For a long time, I could not bring myself to identify it, with a little ill-smelling pool in places not wider than a yard, without current, with no green on its banks. Thus, the first statement I gained from the experience of others, that Kishinev was located on the River Beek, proved to be incorrect. There is no river or even brook in Kishinev. The River Beek does indeed exist. A modest extension of the Dniester River. In the hot months of summer, when Urusov first saw it, it would in fact have been reduced to little more than a swamp. Still, the passage haunts because the object of Urusov's frustration is a guide to Bessarabia, published in Moscow in 1903, written by one Pavel Khrushchevan, who was soon also to publish and likely write or co-write the first version of the most infamous forgery in modern history, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Thus, the image of Urusov, a well-intentioned Russian official quite sympathetic to Jews, hunting on a sweltering summer day for a river described in a book written by one of the world's most notorious fantasists, provides a bracing entree point for our tour of Kishinev too. I started this book as I signed a trade contract to write a survey of Russian and East European Jewish history from the 18th century to the present. And to save myself from insomnia, I sliced it into various parts and decided to devote 3 or 4 weeks to each of these parts. And the Kishinev pogrom was simply one of those parts. And what I started to find was the way in which the event so insinuated itself into the understanding of the Jewish past by Jews, by Jew haters, by others, that I found it impossible to turn away from the topic. And what had started as a 3-week, 4-week, 5-week foray ended up being a foray longer than I am willing to acknowledge. And I wrote the book, or I tried to write the book in such a way that at every turn it would teach something new to specialists, but not lose non-specialists, and tested really every sentence along those lines. And what that meant was I just kept on cutting. I kept on cutting things that really I didn't need to say. Lucy Davidowitz, the well-known Holocaust historian who I knew rather well when I was a graduate student, I remember turned to me and said rather emphatically, she was a human being who said almost everything emphatically, she said, you don't need to actually tell people everything you know. And that proved to be a very useful lesson as I wrote this book and sought to write it without scanting its scholarly preoccupations, but without losing the common reader, as Virginia Woolf called him or her, and who still very much exists and deserves books on history. I mean, the problem that I faced from the outset is this. There were some 47 Jews who died in the Kishinev pogrom, 2 later as a result of wounds incurred as a result of the pogrom. And yet the very meaning of pogrom, as we'll see in a few minutes, ended up being attached to this event. In contrast, some 600 to 800 Jews were killed on the streets of Odessa in October 1905, and yet Odessa would not be known primarily, certainly, as a city of pogroms. probably as many as between 150 and 200,000 Jews were killed in the midst of the anarchy, the banditry that followed in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution between 1918 and 1921. And yet the towns in which they died, with almost no exceptions, were remembered only by their descendants at best and by no one else. And yet this particular event etched itself onto history as to be the inspiration for such a wide variety of endeavors and institutions, and I sought to try to understand why. Some of the reasons are reasonably self-evident. First, chronology. It's the first anti-Jewish event of any significance that occurs at the beginning of the 20th century, a century that is presumed, we could look back at this somewhat ironically, to usher in a time of peace, of harmony, to be a good century for Jews and for others. So some of it has to do with simply chronology, the shock that this event actually happens at the dawn of the 20th century. Some of it has to do with ideology, namely this is the one Jewish event of the time that is embraced across the entire spectrum of enormously fractious Jewish ideological life. If anyone tells you from the local federation or elsewhere that Jews have always agreed on things, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. There's this notion that we are one, and yet there's that joke, 3 Jews, 4 shuls. And at the turn of the 20th century, Jews were torn apart, and especially in the Russian Empire, for a wide variety of reasons, by warring ideologies. Zionists were torn apart by various sectors within Zionism. Jewish socialists, territorialists who were looking for a home for Jews outside of Palestine. Even movements that weren't avowedly Jewish essentially were Jewish, like Esperanto, the effort to create a universal language. There was a popular joke that was told at the turn of the 20th century, and it goes something like this: what language is spoken at an Esperanto conference? And the answer is Yiddish. The founder is a Jew from Warsaw, and basically the bulk of the constituency are Jews hungry for universalistic ideology and embracing Esperanto. This community was enormously divided along ideological lines, and yet Kishinev was the one event of the time that actually was embraced by all. And then there was technology. It was the first Jewish event, certainly the first Jewish catastrophe, that is actually captured in photographs. And photography, of course, is invented some decades earlier, but it's expensive. It's rarely employed by newspapers, but newspapers, Jewish and other newspapers, carry pictures of the Kishinev dead. And connected with that, ironically, I would suggest that the relatively small number of Jews killed also had its impact on etching the event onto history. There were some 47 Jews killed at the outset, as I mentioned before, and all of them could be and were reproduced on a photograph that was widely distributed throughout the Western press, the Jewish press, and others. You can't reproduce 600 dead in a photograph. Typologically, the phenomenon is something akin to the way in which the story of Anne Frank managed to communicate a tale of 6 million murdered. 6 million is very, very difficult, almost inconceivable to think of, but you have one picture of tragedy similar to that Syrian boy on the beach that could capture the story that captured the attention of the world for about 5 minutes as to the Syrian tragedy. Those 47 Jews were captured in photographs, reproduced in countless times throughout the press in the Western world, the Jewish press and elsewhere. And so the relatively small number of Jews killed actually had its impact as well. And then, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, there were a whole variety of contingent reasons. The notion that history is predictable, that it's easy, that anything is easy, that, you turn on television today and you hear the most powerful person in the world talking about how everything is easy. But the notion that the past is easy is nonsensical. There's massive amounts of contingency in almost any event, and you begin to generalize about an event that you know about, and you realize that you're talking near nonsense. Much of the reason why Kishinev actually becomes an event that is well known has to do with the location of the town, just about 100 miles east of the most porous of all Russian borders, the Romanian border, the area that's easiest to smuggle goods through and news through. And we'll see that news of the Kishinev pogrom is communicated with alacrity, with an alacrity that would have been inconceivable had the same pogrom been 100 miles to the east of Kishinev, say, in Odessa. Contingency also figures into the impact of climate on the pogrom. Pogroms, like revolutions, happen in temperate weather. And the February Revolution of 1917 happens when the weather actually gets better. And as it happens, the second and most vicious day of the pogrom, it was raining until about 6 a.m. Had the rain continued into the afternoon, almost certainly the pogrom wouldn't have occurred as it occurred. And so the role of contingency is enormously important, but there are all sorts of other reasons, and other reasons that I dug up over the course of the last several years that made this event into the event that it was. The first has to do with the interplay between government and Kishinev being a hotbed of far-right anti-Semitism. Anti-Semites in late imperial Russia come in many different shapes and sizes. And there was a category in late imperial Russia called a respectable anti-Semite. And someone who actually could pass in public, someone who actually wasn't, someone who didn't believe, for example, that Bayless had killed a child and engaged in ritual murder. There's a story that the eventual president of Israel, the first president, Chaim Weizmann, tells in his memoirs. Chaim Weizmann in the mid-30s, in a moment of indiscretion, tells the Jewish Telegraphic Agency that the goal of Zionism is not to create a state. And he's thrown out of the presidency of the Zionist movement for like a year or two, but he continues to run it, and then he's brought back in. Anyway, so he's sitting with a bunch of friends when it's clear that he's going to be thrown out of the presidency, and he tells the following story about a respectable anti-Semite. He says he's traveling in a train when he's a young man, and he's in a carriage, and sitting across from him is a respectable anti-Semite. That's the term he uses. And the person tells Chaim Weizmann what he does. And then he turns to young Chaim Weizmann, he says, well, what do you do? Now, remember, this is a joke, okay? And Chaim Weizmann is telling this in a moment of great exasperation when the Jews in his movement have turned on him. So you'll remember that in a moment. And so the honest anti-Semite, the respectable anti-Semite, turns to Chaim Weizmann and says, what do you do? And Chaim Weizmann tells him. And the person wags his finger at Chaim Weizmann. And the crucial part of the story is that he wags his finger. He wags his finger at Chaim Weizmann and he says, you better watch out for those Jews. If you turn your back on them, they'll kill you. And Kishinev, in contrast, was an epicenter of some of the most extreme anti-Semites in Russia for a whole variety of reasons having to do with the way in which the area had been acquired by Russia, the way in which the fear that Romania was still interested in reacquiring it. Austria-Hungary was just at its north. It was a territory that was a mutt of sorts. And this generated all kinds of xenophobic feelings, and many of them focused in on Jews. What we're now able to reconstruct is that on the eve of the pogrom, a clutch of extreme anti-Semites were at work on a book that was drawn almost word for word from a rather obscure anti-Napoleon III volume published in France in 1863. And instead of attacks on Napoleon III, they injected the word Jew. And we have all kinds of linguistic fingerprints as to how this text actually originates in this region. There's all kinds of constructions that are indigenous to this region. For example, the word goy or Gentile, which you could imagine is used often in this document, and I'm talking about the first version of the Protocols, the Elders of Zion, is Goyevsky, which is the Ukrainian usage, as opposed to Goysky, which is the Russian one. The prepositions are different. All these cleansed in subsequent book versions. They're at work on this text, and then suddenly the Kishinev pogrom breaks out. To some extent, the work of this clutch of anti-Semites, and the entire world is focused on it. It dominates headlines throughout the world. The Hearst press actually is obsessed with it, with headlines about it day after day. It's condemned by Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, who does not condemn lynching in the United States, and yet condemns the pogroms, this pogrom in Russia. In other words, here is, as this group is convinced, a concrete proof that actually Jews do control the media. Jews control the opinion making of the world, and this proof actually is generated from in this provincial town, and they very, very quickly end up finishing this text, published under a slightly different title in a Petersburg newspaper, which is owned and run by Kishinev's leading anti-Semite, Khrushchevan, and the text eventually transmuted from its Ukrainian origins to Russian, eventually comes to be the most notorious and long-standing anti-Semitic text in history, the Protocols, the Elders of Zion. Its origins, in other words, are purely local, purely domestic. And it eventually becomes, for reasons we could talk about later during the question-answer period, if you wish, the only anti-Semitic text that actually continues to have legs to this present day, and is a direct result of a reading of the Kishinev pogrom. Now, this forgery, typologically, now the authors of the Protocols, are what would eventually come to be known as the Protocols, know that they're putting words into the mouth of the so-called elder of the Jews. It's built almost like talk radio. And you have actually the elder of the Jews speaking and actually talking about his designs to take over the world, which is part of the reason, I think, for its continued power. It's not a story told elsewhere. It's actually, you actually have the voice of the elder speaking. The authors clearly know that these aren't the actual words of the elder, but they're convinced that if they actually could tie the elder down, like in a scene in Homeland, and get him to confess his designs, this is what he would say. At the same time, another text surfaces that has, in its own way, an immense impact on the Jewish history, and is written not by anti-Semites, but almost certainly either by Jews or by political radicals who are sympathetic to Jews. 3 weeks after the end of the pogrom, in May 1903, a text surfaces. It's published in the Times of London. The correspondent who publishes it is expelled from Russia. The text is signed by the Minister of Interior, Pleve, and the text basically is structured as a brief message to the Governor General of Bessarabia, telling him not to intervene in the riot. The text, the so-called Pleve letter, is believed to constitute concrete proof that the Russian government actually is not only behind the Kishinev pogrom, but foments violence, killings, looting, rapes on its own street. It appears at the same time or soon after the 1902 reaffirmation of the exclusion of Chinese immigration to the United States, at a time when the Anti-Alien Act is being debated in England, and where there's considerable pressure to actually cut down on the number of Jewish immigrants and other immigrants from Europe. And it's largely because of this text that relatively unrestricted Jewish immigration is permitted to the United States up until the First World War, with laws changed in the 1920s. The text is a forgery. We don't know who wrote the text. It was written for the best of reasons, and it was written also by people who no doubt believed, as vastly different as this text is, much like the authors of what would be the protocols, that had they been able to tie Pleva down, this is what he would say. In other words, it was written with sincerity, and it was a forgery, and its impact was enormous, not only on the history of Jewish immigration to the United States, but what the text actually substantiated for Jews on the left, eventually Jews who were liberal, Jews like me. What it ended up substantiating was that the arch-conservative regime in the world actually fermented attacks on its own streets against Jews. There were many reasons why Jews gravitated toward the left and eventually toward liberalism, and many reasons why, as one sociologist has put it, Jews live typically like Episcopalians but vote like African Americans. But one of the prime reasons for this phenomenon, a phenomenon to the present day in the United States, is because of the Pleva letter, is because of a forgery. I underline this because it's crucial to note, and it's something that I've wrestled with ever since while I was writing this book, is that it's not only people, if you will, on the right who are captured by mythology. All of us are shaped by mythologies. I know the Pleva letter wasn't accurate, and that doesn't change my political views. It doesn't alter them. Mythology captures all of us and shapes our Weltanschauung, and that's certainly true with regard to the Pleva letter. While writing this book, I benefited from the discovery of previously unknown material. It's hard to even call it archival material. It was really just, as it turned out, material on a shelf in Brookline that was some of the most sensitive material about Krusevan that could conceivably have existed. Now, Krusevan himself, he dies at the age of 49 in 1909, and he recedes from history until fairly recently. He's now in the area of current Moldova, wedged between Ukraine and Romania, seen as a kind of ideological pioneer, a champion of anti-liberalism, of anti-Semitism, of homophobia, and of what's called in that region Christian socialism. And this was the Krusevan who seemed to have existed and been a totem of the Russian anti-Semitism, and a figure who has been revived in this highly combustible part of the former Soviet Union. Once I thought I was finished with this book, I was given a tip. What I'm going to be relating to you is an archival story. The historians, we mostly just sit in our rooms and write. That's what we do. And in a work like this, you have to traverse lots of different languages. Our adventure stories are stories in the archive. That's when we get out. and what I'm going to relate to you briefly is a moment. I mean, other people go to clubs. We go to archives. Anyway, I just came up with that. I heard from a German colleague of mine. There's a small group of us who were working on this the most obscure version of the protocols, that there was someone, this former Moldovan Jew who lived down the street from Fenway in Brookline, who had something. And I was off to my last trip in Kishinev the next day. It's been renamed Kishinev from Kishinev. And I went to see him. And I'm sitting together with him, he's a former journalist in Kishinev, and his wife, Luda, in the living room, and we're talking, and then after an hour or two, he takes this large white file from a shelf in his small, modest apartment and puts it on my lap. And what I realized fairly soon is that these are incredibly sensitive documents of Khrushchevans. It turns out this Misha Chazin, who I was visiting, had written a history of a psychiatric hospital at the edge of Kishinev, and Khrushchev's nephew was an inmate in the psychiatric hospital, and then he died, the Soviet Union imploded, the belongings were now, the Yiddish word is Hefkerwelt, belongings belonged to nobody, and Chazin was given these documents, the documents of the nephew. And the nephew, in turn, it seems clear, was given these documents because these were Khrushchev's most sensitive documents, and the nephew was like a son to him, and Khrushchev died childless for reasons that will be clear in a moment. Now remember, Khrushchev is known to this day as one of the great emblems of not anti-Semitism, but homophobia, anti-capitalism, etc. Among these papers was an adolescent diary that he kept at the age of 15 or 16, where he speaks with great vividness about the sex that he's having with a Cossack of the male persuasion, and how he wishes he was born a lady. And what became obvious in going through these documents was that Khrushchev's sister ran away with a Jew named Bronstein, and settled initially in New York, where he was a shamus, a sexton in a synagogue. Eventually they moved to Baltimore because too many people connect her with Khrushchev. And also, and this is in a passing reference in the nephew's own memoirs, but I can't imagine he would have made this up. We did know that Khrushchev lost his mother at the age of 1, and he had a rather distant relationship with his stepmother. His nephew insists that his stepmother was Jewish, and no doubt then converted. It's the sort of story that if, rather than working with the nonfiction editor at Norton, I was working with the fiction editor at Norton, and if I had given him or her this text, they would have told me life is not like this, and please rewrite this and just sort of, take out some of these absurd details, stranger than fiction. And but what I also learned, no less pertinent, was that Khrushchev, who was considered at the time the most powerful and well-placed anti-Semite in Russia, experienced serial bankruptcy. There were bailiffs who assessed his belongings, rather sparse belongings. I know the kind of wood that his bookshelves were made out of, his desk was made out of. He has so little money that he tries to sell his library and even his printing presses. In other words, just once you begin to scratch beneath the surface of what you assume you know, you learn how little that you actually know, and I was able to include much of this in the book as well. Let me turn to the very last chapter, and a chapter of the book that I knew almost nothing about until I had to know a good deal about it. So in the midst of this enormous hubbub about the pogrom, and a hubbub in the United States that's generated in no small measure by William Randolph Hearst. And tell me if this reminds you of anyone. William Randolph Hearst inherits his money. I've just started. Okay, he inherits his money. He has the beginning of a thriving business, but he's hungry for political power. He's hoping to run either for the Democratic ticket for the governor of New York, or perhaps for the Democratic ticket to run for the presidency. And in New York, there's already a politically vibrant, numerous Jewish community that he begins to court. and he places enormous emphasis on the Kishinev pogrom. He sends to Kishinev this practice journalist, Michael Davitt, who is actually credited as the founder of the British Labour Party, who ends up writing the first best-selling book on the Jews of Russia based on his reportage for the Hearst Press, and who just parenthetically, and I did not include this in the book because I couldn't really prove it, the word pale is in the subtitle of his book on the Kishinev pogrom. And of course, the word pale ends up being the term that's widely used to describe the areas, the 15 provinces in Russia where the vast majority of Jews end up living until the Russian Revolution. The word pale is not a translation from the Russian. The literal translation for the Russian is line of settlement, not pale of settlement. But the term pale is actually widely used in Irish culture to describe the fortified area around medieval Dublin. It's not unlikely that actually the common usage of the term pale actually comes from an Irish journalist, and then is introduced into the popular Jewish imagination. But be that as it may, there ends up being a huge amount of talk about pogroms, and concomitantly, a good deal of comment in a whole slew of independent African American newspapers about expressing sympathy for the Jews of Russia, but a degree of exasperation as to how such attention has been paid to the tragedies of the Jews of Russia, while there's barely any attention given to the incidents of lynching in the United States. The left largely ignored lynching. The Socialist Party largely ignored lynching because of a possible competition between black workers and white workers. And by and large, lynching ended up being blamed on the victims themselves, blamed on African-American sexual appetite, on African-American competition with white workers, African-Americans working in close cooperation with city bosses. In much the same way that at the time, among many Russians, not even avowed anti-Semites, pogroms were blamed on Jews. Pogroms were often blamed on Jewish economic rapacity, on Jewish radicalism, etc. And so an entire body of journalistic literature ended up being generated in the wake of the Kishinev pogrom about why is it that these attacks in faraway Russia were the focus of such attention in the United States, while there was barely any attention on lynching. Even the most famous of all African-American leaders in the United States, Booker T. Washington, refused to condemn lynching by and large at all, while condemning the Kishinev pogrom. This had no institutional impact until after the 1905-1906 pogroms, when an unusual, remarkable couple, William English Walling, who becomes the first chair of the NAACP, and his wife, Anna Strunsky, I'm happy to say a Stanford graduate, an erstwhile lover of Jack London. They co-wrote a book together on the nature of male and female love. She's fluent in Russian and Yiddish. They end up marrying, traveling together to Russia. He writes a book called Russia's Message, which ends up being the major book in a Western language about Russian radicalism before John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World. And on the stage of Cooper Union, that marvelous institution that intersects the Village and the Lower East Side in New York, in a book launch for this book, Anna Strunsky, quite spontaneously, says, you know, as bad as pogroms are, lynchings are as bad, if not worse. And that comment, that very night, inspires a series of meetings into the night, and a meeting in their apartment in the West 30s that serves as the meeting that creates what comes to be known as the NDoubleACP. It's created in 1908 with a different name, and then the name is changed, and William Walling becomes his first chair. A side story to all this, and a story that's so typical in the writing of the history of women. It's Anna Strunsky's idea, but she's suffered from a series of miscarriages she's unable to even go into the living room at the meeting that plans the NAACP in her own apartment because she's wrestling with the prospect of a miscarriage. She's unable to actually go to the founding meeting of the NAACP, where her husband is named chair, because she's also worried about a miscarriage. She's the woman in many ways who inspires the idea of the NAACP and barely is mentioned in any history of the NAACP. It's just part and parcel of what the writing of so much of women's history is about. I'll read the end of the book and then we'll talk. Okay? The city at the heart of the story, renamed Kishinev after the fall of the Soviet Union and the creation of an independent Moldova, is a place known mostly in recent years as one of the world's notorious depots for international prostitution, the capital of a fast-crumbling nation-state bedeviled by corruption, petty and grandiose, with an ambiguous identity readily absorbable either into that of Romania or perhaps less likely Russia. Kishinev itself possesses a certain great tired grandeur, a few largest parks in the city center, an imposing arch just outside its main state buildings, a beautiful ethnographic museum situated in a leafy part of town, peppered with some of the city's more fashionable houses and embassies. To be sure, nearly all its streets are badly potholed and in need of repair. Police corruption accompanied by shakedowns of foreigners are no less a fixture of the local scene than its undrinkable water. There are hints of gentrification in a cluster of the city's oldest neighborhoods, whose decrepitude the newly rich, their source of wealth at best legally ambiguous, have designated as enticing. Most of the city's Jews decamped long ago for Israel or the United States. A local literary scholar whose specialty is Khrushchev's fiction, for which he had great admiration, explained to me as we were sitting at the local Jewish community library that had Jews not left Kishinev in the 1990s, it would now be faring far better economically. Yet she had insisted just a few moments earlier that the real reason for the outbreak of the 1903 pogrom was that the city was packed with far too many Jews, with this justly exasperating locals. Though pressed, she acknowledged no contradiction in what she had just said. The city's grim past retains a palpable presence, not only because of the pogrom's lingering infamy, but also because so many of its original crumbling buildings, despite a massive earthquake in 1940, and of course the devastation of its Jewish population in World War II, have survived largely as a result of Kishinev's chronic poverty. It's a shambling, unpretentious place, surprisingly lush, village-like in some of its corners, still bounded at its northern edge by the unassuming but harsh eyesore, the River Beek. A cement bridge stretches across this marshland, with the old town just around the corner, a quick walk from Asia Street, now renamed, a tenement brushing up against the street's clapboard structures, which have weathered so much with no evidence. Needless to say, this was once and still remains one of the most storied sites of the recent Jewish past. This was the town where a large number of the Jews killed in the pogrom were killed. The dusty street is crowded in daytime with earnest, hardworking locals, women with their shopping bags, school children, there's an elementary school nearby, men lugging tools. Densely housed, a hodgepodge of Soviet-age construction in century-old piles. It's a place that has inspired lessons of heroism and shame, cowardice and militancy, loathing or trust for Gentiles, and as many would come to believe, it was here in this crowded alleyway where exile reached its sudden, bloody end. Thank you. Let's talk.
Plenty of time for questions and discussion, but we have to use this microphone. So I'll run it around, but please use the microphone. So you're going to start. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. So, you know, the pogrom that you describe in your book got a lot of publicity. Had there been prior anti-Semitic acts and maybe even worse pogroms in Kishinev?
No, not in Kishinev. There were a wave of anti-Jewish attacks between 1881 and 1882, and some sporadic attacks in the 1890s. But interestingly, the term pogrom, and I didn't mention this earlier, the term pogrom is just one of a medley of terms used for anti-Jewish attacks and for riots. And most of the riots in Imperial Russia at the time are rural riots, not urban riots, and most of them do not involve Jews. They're mostly food riots. And the term pogrom ends up being etched onto the Jewish consciousness and beyond in the wake of the Kishinev pogrom. The term itself is, when used in the English language press, the German press, the French press, through 1903, is either italicized or defined. By 1904, it's as well known a word as vodka or tsar. And what it comes to be known as, and this is in the wake of the Plevin letter, is a government condoned or sponsored attack against Jews. And that's what the term ends up being defined as in dictionary definitions and elsewhere. And that's because of the belief that the Kishinev pogrom is government condoned or coordinated, and that belief is incorrect. And the term ends up being immeasurably more elastic than any other term describing Jewish atrocity. The Holocaust is very specific. Pogrom ends up being used eventually to describe medieval anti-Jewish attacks, all sorts of attacks in Salonika. The Kahan Commission that investigates the tragedy of Sabra and Shatila describes the event as a pogrom. And it ends up achieving an extraordinary promiscuity.
Other comments or questions?
Thank you. What's the relevance of the pogroms to 2019 current international global melting pot we have?
All right, so I prepared for this one. So what did you learn from this book that has any relevance to today? Is that a reasonable recasting of your question? Let me start with that, and then I'll come but I'll tell me if I'm not understanding you. The first thing I learned was that hatred, anti-Jewish hatred, say in Kishinev, is relatively inchoate. There are all sorts of feelings that are felt toward Jews in April 1903. There's admiration. There are numerous incidents of Jews who are fearing or being attacked, running into the courtyards or the homes of non-Jews, fully expecting to be protected and being protected. And it's a vicious, terrible anti-Jewish attack in which 900 are arrested in a town of 100,000. And the notion that consequently Kishinev and consequently Imperial Russia is a hotbed of anti-Jewish animus isn't accurate. It's not entirely inaccurate. It's not entirely accurate. What I did learn from this event, and this is in line with other recent studies of anti-Semitism, is that such attacks rarely, if ever, occur without intellectuals or leaders, political leaders or otherwise, giving anti-Jewish animus coherence. And that's what Khrushchev did. That's what so often happens in racialist attacks, that in this particular instance, there's an adolescent boy who disappears in an adjacent town, and Jews in that town are accused of engaging in ritual murder. Now, ritual murder is it's very hard to disprove something that doesn't exist. This was a problem in the Bayless case in 1913. Typically, what you do in the law court in a case of ritual murder is that you investigate, or what a coroner does, and this was true of the coroner's reports in this town near Kishinev, just a month or so before the pogrom, is that you investigate whether the blood of the child was drained. Because ostensibly in a ritual murder, you drain the blood in order to use it for Jewish ritual purposes, presumably during Passover. The problem with that is self-evident. In other words, what implicit is that if the blood was drained, it was a ritual murder, but ritual murder doesn't exist. So it's an enormous conundrum to disprove something that doesn't exist. But by and large, one lesson that I learned, and tell me if this is in any way pertinent to your question, is the way in which this kind of animus requires the coherence of either a political leader an ideological leader to give it voice. And if that comment doesn't have any pertinence to today, I don't know what comment does. So I would start there. And yes.
So how many of those political leaders are breathing life into such thoughts around the world right now? 40, 30?
So you know you're speaking to an historian, right? And so, look, it's, I might have opinions about the present, but I know with some authority about the past. And knowing with some authority about the past is no small feat. I mean, how many rooms have you been in with people, and then you left those rooms, and then the people in the room reconstructed what happened in vastly different ways? As an historian, I'm not in the room. Okay, I have to reconstruct those rooms without having been there. And we construct those rooms with what we call archival evidence. And all archives are the papers that happen to have fallen onto the floor and then put into files somehow, and then we read those and we try to reconstruct the past. So the present I can talk about as coherently, I suspect, as you and your friends. The past, ask me questions about the past, okay?